education is a wicked problem. It involves lots of other issues, which makes education coverage so interesting, but it also makes the solutions not simple silver bullet issues.
Education is transforming at lightning speed. While we once imagined AI, virtual reality, and personalized learning as distant possibilities, today they're reshaping classrooms across the globe.
Different technologies come around and the same conversations ended up happening. So there is a sense of déjà vu.
But the big questions remain. How do we ensure these powerful tools reach every student? How do we help teachers adapt? And most importantly, how do we use tech to genuinely improve learning, not just digitize the status quo? Here to guide us through this evolving landscape is Jeffrey R. Young, former senior editor at EdSearch and host of their influential weekly podcast. He spent years on the front lines of education technology, tracking the innovations that are reshaping how we teach and how we learn. Jeffrey, welcome to the show. Jeffrey, I've been looking forward to having you on. There's so much to unpack with this changing landscape of education. But first, what drew you to this field?
I wanted to be a reporter in the sort of days when the internet was still kind of new. It was before iPhones and iPads for especially younger folks. I was really interested in covering that space of how technology was changing society. I ended up finding a reporting job at the Chronicle of Higher Education, and it really let me have this front row seat to talking to people that were theorizing, experimenting, and imagining a world where people could be connected not just by geography, but to people that were outside their immediate, just who they happened to live near or be near. Yep. It was a place where I was able to cover the tech and talk to people. I got to sit down with Steve Jobs once and interview him because he spoke at an education conference when he was trying to make sure the Mac was still relevant back in the day. I really fell in love with education coverage the more I did it. It didn't take long because the issues that professors and education leaders were facing were so interesting to me. I ended up covering other things within education and shifting over time, not just on technology, but covering college admissions and other aspects of how education plays such a huge role in opportunity in America. Different technologies come around and the same conversations ended up happening. There is a sense of déjà vu. I find myself in my writing and in journalism just reminding people in some ways, just pulling up those
been there, done that.
Well, yeah, and I think you're asking a great question. I don't know if anyone has the answer, but I do think it's worth remembering, right?
Yes,
these
not in a negative. I do sense there's a little, almost like there's been an ed form fatigue that took place. Where people are feeling like, hey, we're hearing this, but that leads me to the changing landscape of our learning environments. I do have the feeling that some of that optimism and even a little fear is coming back because of AI and ChatGPT and some of these emerging technologies. Let's talk a little bit about that.
If a trend comes along, the question is like, is this time?
Can we get excited for real?
Yeah. And I think it's both excited and some would say fear, because there's also the case that some people maybe don't want the change. So how worried should they be, or how the optimists, how excited should they be? What is really going to change? And I just, one more, like back in 10 years ago, I think of the MOOC, the massive open online courses that was in the college space. And that was a big moment where college professors said, let's just open up our teaching and say anybody can download our Stanford course, Harvard course, or MIT course, and we'll make the assignments available, make it all out there, and people can, self-study, and this will be a big changer. And then I think I think that it didn't, there was a moment where it seemed like that was going to change a lot of things, but now it made some changes, but it didn't end college as we know it. The question, and that was seen as something very different than previous zones. But I think with AI, since that is the moment we're in, I think there is a question whether this could have a bigger impact. And I think partly because, unlike some of these previous technologies. There's a lot of uncertainty around how much it's going to change the workforce and a lot of white collar jobs, the kind of jobs that colleges and the education system, the K-12 and college system, have traditionally prepared people for. And so I think that's kind of one of the questions I'm wondering is like, the biggest change in those other examples were like changes in method for the teaching practice. And there's some of that obviously with, can AI tutor, and then could that help jumpstart learning?
I think with AI and career learning, the old school, you have voc ed or all that, but because the technology the AI technology bleeds into both areas, school to career programs are vastly different now. Kids are getting their certifications and going straight in the workforce. In fact, a kid with a computer programming certification graduating from high school will make more than a kid with a computer science degree in college because they have the certification already. And so I want to get your thoughts on that.
I think it's interesting. It'll be interesting to see how much of that is happening compared to the past. I think one of the trickiest things is that I'm seeing uneven or inconsistent policies even in places that use AI or that are buying AI for their employees.
Isn't part of that the fear too? Those inconsistent policies?
Is it fear that the companies aren't adopting it, or is it a mix of wanting to wait to see what the use cases are? It happens a lot in Silicon Valley where you have a technology tool that is exciting and new, but you're not exactly sure what it is that it's, they used to say killer app, like killer application is, that it's going to be the thing that really makes, that really gets people to use it, tech,
So many people have complained about the cost of college. If you're able to get those skill certifications and not go to college, more and more people are questioning, the value of getting that 4-year degree, particularly liberal arts degree, having that debt. I mean, what are your thoughts around that and how higher ed needs to be more responsive to everyday people and their fears, even if they want to send their kid to college, if they see value in going through a career path in high school that leads to a good job, good career, and not have the debt, that's become a real thing.
Yeah, well, I did a podcast series for the EdSurge podcast called Doubting College that ran not too long ago and really dug into those questions. I think, I personally am not coming down either way on this, but you're right. There is a change in the conversation around whether to go to college for a lot of people leaving high school. It's an interesting time. I got to spend some time in a high school here in St. Paul, Minnesota, and talk to students and guidance counselors. What is really different? Because everything's changing. And what was it really like on the ground? I went to a high school called Central High School, which is one of the oldest high schools in the state of Minnesota, public high schools. And they have a good track record of sending diverse students to college. So they're a great place to prepare students for college. But a lot of students, more students there in the past are doing gap years. More students are doing a lot more career exploration, so to speak, in the high school, like before, like trying to figure out why college, not just default to college. And I think, that seems like one of the big changes, not necessarily. So there is a skepticism of like, instead of just saying like, of course you'll go because it's the thing to do, more students, even those that can afford it, without too much stress, but especially those who it's a little harder, or going to be taking out more of those loans, were, let's figure out a plan before jumping in.
Yeah.
And a lot of it came from hearing from cousins or people that they'd seen go through it without a plan and not feel like they could use their degree right away. And so I think that some of it was a consumer savvy that was happening, and a different conversation around, instead of this idea of like, oh, if a college takes me, that's great, to like, what is the right college that will get the student what they are looking for and the family what they need. So I think I look at some options like trade school or areas that had been kind of for some people and not for others. I think there's a little bit of a reset, and there's a talk of maybe there'll be more of a reset. I think none of these things there's the talk of it, but on the ground, everything happens pretty slowly with some of those social attitudes. But I think there's some talk that maybe some of those options will be more open to anyone in a way that people are changing who makes up different slots within our pathways. So
we talk about education as a core value in this country, but I don't think it really is in the same way it is in other places where they really want to make sure that every child gets it. Here, if your child isn't getting it, you're trying to figure out how you can go somewhere where they can or be part of that group that is getting it.
I think I like to try to think about these narratives that are the stories we tell ourselves as a country, as a society about education. And I think you're tapping into some of that. There are maybe some competing narratives. One of the ones we did a narrative podcast series a couple of years ago that I'm really proud of called Bootstraps, where we looked at who gets what opportunities in American education. It really was the case that as we looked at some of the history of things like gifted and talented programs, they were driven in a large part by this concern, and you still see this concern in the Silicon Valley set with AI about, well, to really focus or like put a lot of emphasis on a concern about the top students not getting what they need. Somehow the top students being held back and needing to get as much as they can. But there's this other narrative that drove this effort to identify top students and put a lot of resources into that. The other narratives that we hear plenty that have been talked about in policy over time have been like, making sure every child gets equal access to education. There's a bar, it's high that everyone has access to. And sometimes it feels like those narratives can be in conflict in this country. I think resolving what you're going for when you set up a public education system or set up an education system and looking at that seems to be a debate that we don't have straight on. As people talk about policy conversations, it can be focused on smaller pieces. Education, as you know, is a wicked problem. It involves lots of other issues, which makes education coverage so interesting, but it also makes the solutions not simple issues.
Yeah, and I agree with that. When I talk about the achievement gap, there are those who aren't getting that should be, and there are those who should be getting more. They're getting enough. You talk about the talented and gifted, but it seems that from the very beginning, from the moment a child enters a public schoolhouse door, there should be this understanding that we're invested in having each of these children reach their full potential. I think we tend to categorize children a little too early, which sets them on the path either up or down, whatever that looks like. I think that we try to get away from that when we started the buzzwords personalized learning. Like we're going to figure out, what's the kid need, and we're going to, if they're talented, gifted, or if they need more remediation, we're going to figure it out. If they've got trauma, mental health, we're going to work through that. I think we're on to something there, but
one of the lessons covering some of these trends over time, you do need to watch out for the unintended consequences, because that's something we have definitely seen in past technology waves. You see it, for instance, with attention in the classroom and the issue of banning smartphones or not. That issue to me is also a deeper question of the challenges not just kids but grown-ups are facing with their tools, that the technology in their pocket of their smartphone and other devices and video games for kids kind of being so attention grabbing and designed to get their attention. Just now I had to silence a notification. I thought I'd turn them all off on my laptop here. And so the question is, we're still as grown-ups in the room trying to navigate and balance the way technology has entered our lives and get more good than bad out of it. And I think in the classroom, that is continually an issue these days that I hear from especially high schools and college teachers who are struggling with keeping the attention of their students, or even if they put away the devices. Some students are still itchy to look at their phone to check a text that might have just vibrated. So then the question is, how do we think through the AI could do? And I had a conversation that I hope to put out as a podcast soon with a researcher who talks about how to implement AI to make sure we don't just use, his view is that if you just take AI and have it do things for us, whether we're workers or white collar workers or students, like to have it write our proposal or do our homework. The risk is that over time, we're going to lose the skills to be able to spin those up without the tool.
Yep.
And so his view is, how do we design the tools so that they are doing what the tech can do best, that the human mind is not as good at, like sorting vast amounts of data, keeping it all in mind at once, that we're not going to do, but the humans can do the meaning, what does this all mean? What's our North Star? What are we really going for?
Contextualize.
And contextualize, that the computer is not, it's not built to do, it's not good. It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
I guess there's this argument of general AGI of whether we'll get to these robots that are like humans. But right now we don't have that. So what we have is a tool that can't be what a human can be. And so I think that gets at like understanding sort of things like social media that have had some negative consequences, especially for teens. And okay, like, let's see what we've done. Can we go back and think through what we did? And could we learn from that as we adopt AI? And so this particular researcher argues that if we design the tools to really maximize a co-pilot idea, can we actually design it so it's not just doing human work and taking human work away from humans, but that it is doing something that doesn't work unless a human's there, and that the human's doing what the human does best, the tool is doing what the tool does best, and there could be exciting things, right? Then you can imagine.
Yeah, I see.
And that's what people, so I guess I think that's maybe something that is worth just taking that moment. Often the people who are really excited about the tools kind of sometimes can blame people saying, let's talk about that, as like being fearful or somehow resistant. But what if it's not? Is it resistance, or is it basically we're all in the room planning this thing together, and it's a valid viewpoint in the conversation where, what do we do with this tool and how can we bring it to education? I think that's the question. So who's at the table is sometimes one of those questions that I have.
Yeah.
Is at the table, and are people excluded from the table because they have concerns as being kind of difficult, or are they the very people that need to be in the room? And then in the end, maybe as things evolve, we do see that these benefits outweigh risks, or that these can be implemented in a way that are carefully, thought through.
Yeah. I like that thought. I will say, Jeffrey, that what comes to mind hearing you talk about that researcher's perspective is whether or not AI will reshape us, or we're going to reshape how we use AI. Because that really gets to the heart of the fears and the opportunities. People are so concerned about being overtaken by robots or computers, but if we use the tool in a way, that co-pilot example, it could be intriguing. Jeffrey Young, I really appreciate you joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. I could talk to you for much longer, but then people will cut me out and, scroll past to you. But thank you so much, and I wish you the best. I appreciate you joining us on What I Want to Know. Thanks for listening to What I Want to Know. Be sure to follow and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app, so you can explore other episodes and dive into our discussions on the future of education. And write a review of the show. I also encourage you to join the conversation and let me know what you want to know using hashtag WIWTK on social media. That's hashtag WIWTK. For more information on Stride and online education, visit stridelearning.com. I'm your host, Kevin P. Chavous. Thank you for joining What I Want to Know.